So Stephen Sindoni, he's a researcher, a truth seeker. You've heard him here on Coast to Coast several times. And from an early age, he was an avid reader. He spent much of his time learning about American history and ancient civilizations and religions and Greek mythology. And, of course, he's got this quest to uncover ancient truths. And he came to a realization that he was an old soul living in a new embodiment. And we're going to hear about all these really cool things that he has discovered along the way, and he has found out along the way. Why? Because he's actually went out and done it. Maybe he does research with books and different things like that too, but he goes out and does it. And that's what I suggest you guys do as well. When you have these questions, don't bombard us that have seen it and done it ourselves. Go out there yourselves. Go check it out. Come on. Come on. Be brave. Let's make it happen. So Stephen has lots of different videos out there. He's a documentarian as well. Check out his videos. He's got a lot of great things to look at and learn, and he's been all over the place. And one of the areas that I want him to really get into and teach me and teach you guys is underground. Is it a possibility? Again, Hollow Earth and maybe different civilizations. I don't know. Let's find out from him. So, Stephen, welcome to Coast. It was so great meeting you on the phone. We have so many similarities, and I'm looking forward to the stories you're telling us tonight.
Well, I thank you, Connie, again, for having me on. I'll just give a quick little opening as to really who I am, a snapshot.
Sure.
I am Stephen Sindoni, longtime Hollow Earth researcher with a number of websites out there, Hollow Earth Exposed for one, and I am a seeker of truth, as you mentioned. In around 2007, I was first introduced to a book called The Smoky God, A Voyage to the Inner World. And it's a story about a father and son's account of their voyage into an inner world where they were received and rescued by giants who they spent 2 years with these inhabitants and visited the original Garden of Eden. Olaf provided maps and drawings to author Willis George Emerson on his deathbed. He waited until he was almost, dead before he shared this story. So The Smoky God is a voyage to the inner world in the book presented as a true account written by author Willis George Emerson in 1908. So this didn't happen that long ago. And it describes the adventures of Olaf Jansen, a Norwegian sailor who sailed with his father through an entrance in the north interior into the inner earth. And I was enthralled by the story. As a child, I remembered reading about Jules Verne's novels, Journey to the Center of the Earth.
Oh, yeah.
And that piqued my interest, where I felt compelled after reading this story in the book. I decided I was going to narrate it in 2011 and add it to one of my YouTube channels because I was really, I was just mesmerized by it. And I said, this is going somewhere. I don't know yet, but I want to go research it. So in 2014, I was contacted by a fellow Hollow Earth researcher whose name is Chris Baird, and he asked that I investigate the life of Norwegian sailor Olaf Jansen and to figure out if Olaf was a figment of author Willis George Emerson's imagination, or was he truly a man that went on this journey to the inner world. So with that information, I said, okay, I'm going to go into the library and do what I do and investigate the life of Olaf Jansen. I had just recently done researching the life of a Stockton mystery, the legend of J.C. Brown, and I was able to discover that the man of the legend was really by the name of John Benjamin Body of the Lord Cowdray Mining Company, and he was the man for 90 years or so that the Stockton Record was trying to figure out who was this man who shows up in 1934 talking about giants. So I was able to recently solve that. While I'm solving that, I was put in the Stockton Record newspaper about, that I solved that. Chris had called me and says, can you do me a favor? He goes, I need you to do this. So I looked at, my friend who was there in the room. I says, you want me to do this? He says, yeah. He goes, because you have the ability. I just have a feeling that you're going to find out some things about this story. And plus you did the narration of it. And a couple of years after I did the narration, the audio books, LibriVox, I believe it was, they actually did the book as well. So there's like a couple of versions out there. But I initially was the one who put it out on YouTube for other people to pick up on it, and I'm glad that I did. And this story is Olaf Jansen's personal account of his voyage in the world, which got him locked up by his uncle Gustav Osterlund, and who was a man of considerable wealth, but Olaf was incarcerated for 28 years for telling his story about what happened in his travels with his father in the inner earth. So Olaf, while he's in prison for this 28 years now, he decides he's going to create maps, drawings, write his memoirs, and write his book. So at the age of 51, in 1862, he's now released from this madhouse that he was in for 28 years, wrongfully, committed. And he dared not say anything to anyone. So what he did was he waited his whole life till after he retired. He went out to work, doing what he knew, what he did best. He was a sailor, a Norwegian sailor. He went back out for about 5 years, worked for someone, Jansen, and then after that, for 22 years, he bought his own ships, and he sailed all over the world, and he made a fortune. At the end of 22 years, he's now retired. He decides to sell all his boats and come to America, which he does, and he spends 12 years in Chicago area before moving on to Los Angeles in 1902. In 1908, he decides he's going to tell his deathbed story, and he meets a man by the name of Willis George Emerson, who befriends him in around the year, 1906, and they become friends, and then within a couple of months later, he gets a phone call by messenger. Actually, a messenger comes and gives him a note and saying, "I'm dying. You need to come here now. You need to hear my story." So Willis George Emerson goes to the home of Olaf Jansen to hear his deathbed confession.
And before you go any further, we'll be right back to tell you that information. I love the fact that his name was Willis. Yeah, you all caught that, right? Everybody, you're listening to Coast AM. Connie Willis here, talking with Stephan Sindoni. Stay with us. This is going to be fantastic stuff tonight. Welcome back to Coast AM. Hi, everybody. I'm Connie Willis. Hope you're having a good evening, good morning. We're talking with Stephan Sindoni, and Stephan was getting right to the climax, right to the final part of his story. So, Stephan, I'm just going to let you step on in and go at it and catch us back up where we were.
Okay, well, the year is 1907, and author Willis George Emerson meets Olaf Jansen in California and becomes friends with him, and gets summoned a couple months later to the house of Olaf Jansen to hear his deathbed confession about what really happened. And when he was summoned to the home, he was told by Olaf that people need to know the truth. And this was Olaf's dying wish, and he would give him all the maps and drawings that he did throughout the time he was incarcerated to share with the world what he learned on his voyage. And he was very, very concerned that it wouldn't be put out until he died, because he said, "I spent 28 years in prison in irons, and I know this won't happen to you, author Willis George Emerson, but I don't want it to happen to me again, because here I am for sharing my story with the ship captain, Angus McPherson, from the whaling ship. He immediately put me in irons and kept me in irons until I got all the way back to Norway, or Sweden, where I came from, Stockholm. And when I told my family and my uncles what happened and where I was, I had a rich uncle named Gustav Osterlund, and initially his uncle was, happy to hear his stories. And he took him to some officials, and I'm sure Olaf showed some of the drawings and maps that he had. And not long after, his uncle Gustav had him committed to a madhouse for 28 long years.
Isn't that something? And you know that later we're talking with Dr. Hasseltine that's going to talk about how you cope with when you see these things and how you cope with how other people react. So it's amazing. You had pointed that out to me as well. That's amazing that is threaded in like that. So
because you think about it, because what he told the author is that not only with his drawings of the inner earth, he had maps of the inner world, and he said the world's geography is incomplete, and the true home of Apollo is in the inner world, and where the Hyperboreans lived. So all these stories of antiquity may not be myths or legends; they may be actual truths.
Mm-hmm.
And when I tell you, when we get to why I'm making this statement now, you'll realize that something happened very sinister in our country's history, and I'm going to bring it to light, and why Columbus's name should not be the name that we remember for discovering America. Olaf Janss's name should be known for discovering the inner world, and this is what my hope is going to be, because once I share with you what happened to suppress this man's information, think about it. Today, in real world today, you see something, tragic event, false flag event, let's just say, I'll just throw it out there, and next thing you know, you're discredited and you're put behind bars. And you know what people believe. They believe whatever newspapers print or what they tell them. So here's a man who doesn't want to go back to confinement, and he's not going to have this story come out until he closes his eyes for the long sleep. So when I'm reading this and watching this unfold, I'm saying, okay, what does a writer need? He needs solitude to write. If you're going to write a book, you better be able to have the peace of mind to do it. A lot of good books are written in prison.
That's true. You're right.
It's just, the funny thing is that you have all the time in the world, yet you don't have the time to do what you have to do. But Olaf said, no, you might have knocked me down, but, I'm like the weeble that wobbles. I'm going to get right back up. So when I'm reading this story, I says, wow, why do I feel so resonated with this man? What is it? And then I realized that by me taking on this story tonight, I am divinely directed and creatively connected, because when I weave this all together masterfully, everybody listening is going to say, Stefan's got the goods. And we want to know why. And
Bring it on.
When we get there, why? Now, we talked about Olaf. One of the things I want to do right now, if I can, Connie,
sure.
I need to establish the timeline for all this, because a lot of people listening, and they probably haven't watched the Smoky God or even watched my Smoky God Revisited for my research to see what I determined upon reading the book and going into the library and actually rolling up my sleeves for a number of years to figure out, is this fact or is it fiction? So if I can briefly go into who Olaf Janssen was, this will help the audience there to understand really what I'm talking about and the significance of why I'm making this point. Olaf was born on October 27th of 1811 on a fishing voyage. His mother and father were fishing, and he was born in a country called Uleborg. They put the party boat to shore, and his mother gave birth to him in a Russian country. So there was no birth certificate for him, but he was born on a fishing trip that the parents had gone to. They were fishing in the Lofoten Islands, which is where Olaf was from. So this is something that when he was born. And then he, at age 14, he started going out with his father, Jans Janssen, on fishing trips. And some of the trips they would go to, they'd go to the Lofoten Islands and they would fish there, and they were merchant seamen, they were fishermen. But one day, Olaf's life changed. His father set out for a fishing trip, but as they went on this fishing trip, they decided they were going to go a little further than they normally went. And they ended up going through an inner world passage after going through some rocky waters and noticing conditions had changed. The weather was getting warmer. It wasn't getting colder the further north they went, and they were perplexed by this. Going through this opening, they ended up just drifting along, and what they saw was penguins 9 feet tall. They saw giraffes that were like 3 times the size on the outside. They saw Tyrannosaurus rex and all these animals that were supposedly extinct, living on the inside and thriving. They then went further, and they were picked up, believe it or not, by an excursion party boat. Now, this is in 1829. There was no excursion party boats in America or in the world at that time. That didn't happen until the Bronze Age, until the shipbuilding took place. So here, the father and son are looking at this excursion liner. Probably looked like one of the ones, the Carnival or something like that. And the ship came over, and what they did is they rescued Olaf and his father. They had some sort of a crane conveyance that took this little sloop up the boat they were in and brought it on the ship. Olaf and his father were like surprised to see that the men who picked them up were giants. They were 12 feet in height.
Wow.
So now one of them ended up speaking English. His name was Jules Galdea. And he took Olaf and his father under his wing, and he took them all over their inner world, and they even met with a high priest, or the king of the inner world, and explained how they got there. And they were welcomed, and they asked them, what is it they wanted to do? And they said, well, we want to stay here with you for a while. And they did. They stayed there a couple of years, and they went to cities like, believe it or not, the Garden of Eden.
Wow.
So the Garden of Eden lies
the real deal.
Within the center of the earth. Now, another interesting thing is there's 4 rivers there. And if I mention the name of the rivers, it'll blow you away. One is the Euphrates, the Gihon. Another one was there's 2 others here. But there's 4 rivers here. And what was interesting, though, is that they are in the Garden of Eden, and they get to see exactly what the world was supposed to be. And they're told that the inner world was where everything began. And then Noah, the story of Adam and Eve about leaving the garden, was all to go to the outer world. They were doomed. They were punished to send them out into the world that we live in, on the outside, on the surface. So you listen to this and you look, wait a minute, there's all these Bibles, all these versions, all these stories. Wait a minute, there is some truth somewhere here. The truth lies somewhere in the middle. Or maybe this man has it all figured out. So here it is, I'm looking at this, and I'm saying, okay, so what are some of his other discoveries? He says that the center of gravity is not at the North Pole, it's 150 miles below the surface. And that's why all these other explorers couldn't find the pole, and he cites some of their names, and he could have only done this when he was incarcerated in confinement where they would give him books and everything. So he was following what was going on with the inner earth, and he says, no, I beg to differ with you in his stories. No, there is no fixed North Pole. It's 150 miles below the surface, and from inside to outside is 300 miles surface. So when you get halfway down, you get to 0 point. And there, as I mentioned, there were 4 rivers, Euphrates, the Pison, the Gihon, and the Hiddekel. And some of them are biblical. And what he claimed, and some of these explorers claimed, above the 60-degree latitude there, they said there were open water seas, and it was warm air there. So here they were finding things that were not normal in that area. So the open sea revealed to me that why? Well, through my research, I found out the deepest waters in the world are there in Baffin Bay, which is near Greenland. There are also the strongest currents there and the strongest winds. So this would explain why no one's able to venture in over there, because those conditions would make it very difficult without the right sort of ship to traverse those waters. So that's another thing why this secret has been kept so long. Also, you've got the Russians and the United States, and they want to keep the secret. They don't want you to know that in Siberia, every other day, tusks are floating onto Siberian waters that are from prehistoric or different things that were, washed out of that inner earth coming and landing on the Siberian waterfront there. So there are some interesting things here that have been discovered by that. So when I look at this book, The Smoky God, Journey to the Inner Earth, I realize that the world's geography has got to be incomplete. Because if what this man is saying is correct, then he shouldn't be put in irons. He should be given a Nobel Prize for, the things that happened to him, wrongfully accused and put in jail. I can tell you the timeline. Olaf and his father were rescued on a ship. And this is 1829. They're taken, they see all these places. And after about 2 years, the father gets homesick and he wants to go home. So they meet again with the king of the world there, or the high priest there, and they told him of their wishes. And they said, well, we don't think you're going to be able to go back the way you came because of the waters and because you'll be going in the wrong direction. But we'll give you your boat back and let you guys go. And they gave them gold and they gave them things to prove that they were in this inner world, because they really, cared about Olaf and his father. Now, Olaf's father stood 6'6", so you can imagine how small he looked in front of the giants who were 12 to 14 feet tall. Mm-hmm. So this is interesting. And the Bible talks about giants as well. And I've done a lot of research about giants. So You look at this, okay, show me the proof. Where's the proof? What do you have? Okay, so here's what we get to that. So Olaf now, him and his father decide they want to come back. They try to go back the way that they came, through the North Passage opening, but they couldn't. It took them 3 months to try to go nowhere. So they decided they were going to go south. Now, the rivers I mentioned run north and south, and they run to the pole openings or the aperture in the South Pole. So they decided they were going to try to traverse the South Pole. When they get to the South Pole opening, they find conditions are very difficult, and the father and son are in a storm there on the South Sea, I believe, there in Antarctica. And the father gets knocked off the sloop. He ends up getting lost at sea. The son tries to save his father, but he can't. So now he's left on an iceberg, right? Just him and the iceberg. His father's dead. He's freezing. Like, what do I do? I've got no food. I've got nothing. My sloop, my boat has just capsized. Woe is me. Luckily for him, a ship, the Arlington, a Scottish whaling ship, saw him on the iceberg. They came over and they picked him up.
Could you imagine? I mean, come on. There's something to that. That's like, come on.
Well, this gets better, Connie, because they pick him up. Angus McPherson,
wow.
Now, he is the ship captain, right? And his job is whaling. His commerce, that's what he does. He asked Olaf, he goes, well, how did you get out here? This iceberg, there's nobody around. You're in the end of the earth. So Olaf tells him the true story about what happened to him and his father. So they says, all right, put your hands behind your back. What are you talking about? So the captain, Angus McPherson, thought he was crazier than a bedbug, and he says, you're going to be confined for this whole trip until we get you back home to Norway. Wow. Unless you change your story, he goes, I'm not taking the handcuffs off.
So it was because he thought he was nutty. It wasn't because he knew something he didn't want to get out there.
Yeah, I think it was because he thought he was crazy as a bedbug. I mean, that's sort of a story. If it's not your perception, you may not want to believe it, especially if it is this magnitude. Olaf's quote, and I'll quote him now in the book, he says, the truth is stranger than fiction. Mm-hmm. So Olaf knew that after he told the story to the ship's captain, he was going to have a hard time getting back to his country. So he gets back 4 years and 8 months from the day that he and his father left. And here it is almost 5 years later, and he finds out his family is dead and his property's been sold. He comes home, he finds
out. And we want to hear that when we come back. I don't want to miss a thing. This is great. I tell you what, I love the story. Stefan is awesome at telling it, too. And, man, I can't wait to get to all the questions I have, too, about what's going on in that inner world, what it looks like, how they got there, how you get in and out. And even though I told a little bit of that, I've got some deeper questions. So stay with us, you guys.
Sindoni. I'm here in front of the New York Public Library at 42nd Street, and we're going to begin the journey for Olaf Jansen and investigate it. So come on in, we'll take the tour together. Hi, I'm here in front of the entrance to the genealogy department, and here's where we're going to start our investigation. We're going to start to find out, was there really a man by the name of Olaf Jansen? So let's see what we can find out. Shall we?
I'll begin our search by heading to the genealogy department, where I will look through border crossings, birth records, death records, and any information that can be found from the clues that I have received reading the book, The Smoky God, A Voyage to the Inner World, in part 1 of the author's foreword, written by Willis George Emerson. So who was this elderly 95-year-old Norwegian sailor living in Los Angeles for the past 6 years, who had spent over a dozen years in the Midwest before emigrating from Sweden, that summoned author Willis George Emerson to his home at 2 o'clock in the morning to share his personal story before crossing over in January of 1908? Olaf Jansen was a Norwegian born in a little seafaring Russian town of Uleborg in the eastern coast of the Gulf of Bothnia, the northern arm of the Baltic Sea. Olaf's parents were on a fishing cruise in the Gulf of Bothnia and put into this Russian town of Uleborg at the time of his birth on the 27th of October in 1811. Olaf's father's name was Jens Jansen and was born at Rodwig on the Scandinavian coast near the Lofoten Islands, but after marrying made his home at Stockholm in Sweden. In 1825, at the age of 14, Olaf made regular trips with his father on all fishing voyages. At the age of 19, on the 3rd day of April in the year of 1829, Olaf's voyage to the inner world would begin. He and his father sailed from Stockholm, Sweden, bound for the Lofoten Islands. As luck would have it, the lure of the northern lights, the aurora borealis, caused Olaf and his father to chart a course towards the North Pole. After spending 2 years with the giant inhabitants from the inner world, Olaf and his father were homesick. It was time to set sail and return home. But they had to pass through treacherous waters to get there. It was during the return trip that the sloop capsized and Olaf's father, Jens, was swallowed up by the sea. Not long after, Olaf was picked up by a whaling ship named the Arlington, commanded by Captain Angus McPherson. Upon telling his story to the captain of the whaling ship about the marvelous discoveries made by Olaf and his father, he was put in irons. Returning to Sweden, he had been absent 4 years and 8 months. The year now was 1835. He was told his mother had died the previous year. Upon his return, the property left by his parents were given back to him. Not long after telling the story in detail to his uncle Gustav Osterlin, a man of considerable property, Olaf urged him to help fund an expedition to make another voyage back to the strange land. At first, his uncle Gustav favored his project. Gustav seemed interested and invited Olaf to go before certain officials and explain to them, as he had to Gustav, the story of his travels and discoveries. Could you imagine Olaf's horror and disappointment upon the conclusion of his narrative that papers were signed by his uncle Gustav, and without warning, Olaf found himself arrested and confined to a madhouse where he remained for 28 long years of suffering? Finally, on the 17th day of October in the year of 1862, at the age of 51 years old, Olaf was released. Returning home, Olaf learned that his uncle Gustav was now dead and the friends of his youth were all gone. Olaf, faced with the reality of being a middle-aged man with the only known record of his existence was that of a madman. Picking up the pieces of his shattered life, Olaf instinctively turned towards the harbor where fishing boats in great numbers were anchored, and within a week, Olaf had shipped out with a fisherman by the name of Jan Hansen, who was starting out on a long fishing cruise to the Lofoten Islands. In only a matter of a short few years, Olaf was able to own a fishing brig of his own. For 27 years, Olaf followed the sea as a fisherman, 5 years working for others, and the last 22 years for himself. In the year 1889, Olaf sold his fishing boats and found that he had accumulated a fortune quite sufficient to allow him to retire and spend the remaining years of his life in America. For a dozen years, Olaf made his home in Chicago, Illinois. He then spent the last 7 years of his life in Los Angeles, California, arriving there on March 4th of the year 1901. Then, in his latter years, just before he was ready to die, he told his story about the strange land, leaving maps and drawings to an author named Willis George Emerson to share with the world. The first question I asked myself, was there any record of Olaf's birth? I was unable to find any birth records. The reason being, Olaf was not born at home. He was born on a fishing trip in a foreign country, Russia. The second question, was there any records of Olaf Jansen entering the United States? No records were found in any of my searches in the New York Public Library. Yet I knew that Olaf Jansen had left his homeland and traveled on a ship to Ellis Island and docked in New York City with all of the immigrants entering America. The third question I asked of myself, was there any records of Olaf Jansen being in Chicago, Illinois? The answer was yes. I was able to find an address and information that confirmed that yes, indeed, Olaf Jansen had arrived and was living in Chicago, Illinois, and the date coincided with the information in Willis George Emerson's author foreword. And there it was, a stroke of good fortune. On the 1892 City of Chicago, Northern District of Illinois Record and Index of Persons Registered of Poll List of Voters on the 5th line was the record for Olaf Jansen. His address, 304 Stephenson Street. Born in Norway, listed as being in America for 3 years and living in Chicago for 3 years, just as the author Willis George Emerson had written in the book The Smoky God. Then search for the 1890 census to see if Olaf Jansen could be found on the 1890 census. An interesting sidebar here, I will note that the 1890 census records are not available. I then asked myself, why were the 1890 census records unavailable? I learned that the 11th U.S. Census that was taken on June 2nd of 1890, and most of the 1890 census was destroyed in 1921 during a fire in the basement of the Commerce Building in Washington, D.C. An interesting fact is that the 1890 census was the first to be compiled using a machine-readable medium, using punch cards and tabulated by machine, a method invented by Herman Holbrook. The total population of 62,947,714 was announced only after 6 weeks of processing. The public reaction to this tabulation was disbelief, as it was widely believed the right answer was at least 75 million people in 1890. Almost all the population schedules were damaged in a fire in 1921, with 25% destroyed and 50% damaged by smoke and water. In December of 1932, according to standard federal record-keeping procedure at the time, the chief clerk of the Bureau of the Census sent the Librarian of Congress a list of papers to be destroyed, including the original 1890 census schedules. The librarian was asked by the Bureau to identify any records which should be retained for historical purposes, but the librarian did not accept the census records. Congress authorized destruction of that list of records on February 21, 1933, and thus the 1890 census remains were destroyed by government order by 1934 and 1935. Why would Congress order the 1890 census records to be destroyed if there was at least 25% or more of the census available? If my estimation is correct, that would mean that at least 25 million records were destroyed. What was the government trying to hide by the destruction of the census? And all of this was done during the infamous first 100 days of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's first term in office. Then I asked myself the question, was there any record of Olaf Jansen living in Los Angeles as claimed by author Willis George Emerson? The answer was yes. I found an address in the Los Angeles City Directory dated in the year of 1908. Halfway down the right page was the name of Olaf Jansen, listed living at 331 West 45th Street in California, just as author Willis George Emerson had claimed in the book. Another important question that needed to be answered: was there a record of birth or a census for Angus McPherson in Scotland? The answer was yes. Angus McPherson was born in 1796 in Scotland. I was able to acquire the 1841 Scotland census that was taken, which proved that Angus McPherson at the time was 45 years old. His birth year was listed as 1796. He was born in Inverness, Scotland, and his occupation was listed as a merchant seaman. As I look back on this research, it never would have been possible had I not become fascinated by the story told by Norwegian sailor Olaf Jansen, and decided to take the time to narrate the book and upload the video to my YouTube channel. And it was fortunate for me that I was contacted by a man named Chris Baird, a fellow Hollow Earth researcher, who insisted that I try to research the life of Olaf Jansen and try to figure out if the man truly existed, or was Olaf Jansen, the man of the story, a figment of author Willis George Emerson's imagination. Are there any photos that have been taken that show of any polar openings in the North or South Pole? The answer is yes. Upon taking on this research, Chris Baird sent me these photos to share with you. The photos provide strong evidence for a hollow Earth and help validate Olaf Jansen's story. Based on the research I have shared on this video today, the evidence is very convincing.
This is Stephen Sindoni at the Long Island Railroad at 34th Street, and my journey ends here with the train. I want to thank you for watching the Smoky God Review. Until next time.